Welcome to the new Transatlantic Cable, a tripartite civil engineering history webinar series. The webinars are coordinated by the History and Heritage Committee of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National History Committee of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, and the Panel for Historical Engineering Works of the Institution of Civil Engineers. In this segment, recorded on November 22nd, 2023, Mrs. Sue Thredder presents a brief history of pneumatic caissons for bridge construction.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Transatlantic Cable webinar that we're going to have today. My name is Nigel Shrive. I'm a member of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering's National History Committee, and I will be the host today. So we've got a busy hour ahead of us. First, a few words about the tripartite webinars, then we'll talk about professional development hour for people in North America, Canada and the US, and how to obtain that hour. We'll introduce the speaker who will then give her presentation on hydraulic caissons for bridge constructions. Follow that with a Q&A session. You'll get your second code word for the PDH. We'll wrap up and then the seminar will finish. So we have the American Society for Civil Engineers, Canadian Society for Civil Engineers, and the Institution of Civil Engineering from the UK. They're all learned societies with the objective of maintaining high standards of practice. And we hope that this transatlantic cable webinar series will improve and help maintain those high standards. So the tripartite webinar series, the objective is to take a look back at things that have happened in the past and collaborate between the three societies and have talks on technical issues that have been of interest to at least two of the three societies. So now here's the first code word that you will need to record. So either write it down or take a screenshot. So let me introduce our speaker, Mrs. Sue Thredder. She's a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and she serves as a member on the archives panel thereof. She's named on the list of the top 50 women in engineering in the UK in 2021. She's been the recipient of several awards for the work in civil engineering education for young people. She has a particular interest in pre-20th century history of bridges and low carbon maintenance thereof, and is now the chief executive of the Rochester Bridge Trust. Now that is a medieval charity that was begun in the 1300s, looks after 3 bridges in the Rochester area and makes information and attention free of charge to the public. Sue has the particular privilege of being the first woman ever to be appointed to the charity in its 624-year history. And she's also the first engineer that's ever been the chief executive of that trust in its 624-year history. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Sue, and she's going to talk to us about the bridge caissons. So Sue, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I suggested pneumatic caissons or compressed air caissons as a subject for this presentation because the technology was first used for bridge construction at Rochester during building of a new bridge between 1850 and 1856. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus only on bridges. There's a whole other story that could be told about the use of compressed air in tunnel construction and in mining, but that's outside the scope of what I'm going to talk about this evening. So, diving bells had been used since antiquity, with the earliest written reference by the Greek philosopher Aristotle in the 4th century BC. And these early diving bells were cast in all kinds of shapes, made from all kinds of materials, not just in the shape of a bell. As they were lowered into the water, the force of the water would push the air up, compressing it and leaving a pocket of breathable air. So divers could work in the bell only until that air was used up, so they were really limited for very short periods and in relatively shallow water. In 1689, a Frenchman, Denis Papin figured out how to get fresh air into those bells to extend their time of use. So he used bellows on the surface attached to a flexible hose, which ran into the water and up inside the bell, providing more fresh and breathable air. It was an Englishman, Edmund Halley, obviously famous for his comet. He improved the diving bell a bit later on by sending down barrels full of air that were attached to the diving bell by a hose and a tap, so that the divers inside the bell could control the flow of air to keep that pressure in the interior of the bell equal to the surrounding water. And things went on like this for quite a while until the English civil engineer John Smeaton invented the diving air pump in 1788. And this pump then meant that workers were able to descend for a reasonable period of time to repair the foundations of Hexham Bridge in northern England. So Smeaton was really one of the first to make use of the diving bell in bridge repair, but you were still only able to use them at the surface of the riverbed. Now, very often credited with independent development of the use of compressed air for working underwater and in waterlogged materials, is a French mining engineer, Jacques Triget, who was born in 1801. He took out a French patent for his method in 1838, and then in the early 1840s successfully sunk a mine shaft into an aquifer of the River Loire to reach a coal stratum. He sent down a cast iron tube made of cylindrical rings, 1.5 meters in radius, bolted together. The tube was open at the bottom, but closed at the top, or rather closed at the point where you can see that hook for the pulley. As with most of these early diagrams, the diameter of the tube there is exaggerated for clarity of the picture. Triget, he compressed atmospheric air by means of what was described as a blowing machine driven by a steam engine. This air was pumped into the lower cylinder, and it acted like a piston, forced out the water which was in the tube out under the bottom edges. And as long as that compressed air kept flowing, the water was excluded from the tube, and the workmen were able to descend to the bottom of the shaft to extract coal from a seam below the water table. And the whole system relied on an arrangement of inlet and outlet valves, with the working chamber accessed via what he called a pressure box, which was an early form of airlock. Now, Triget is sometimes credited with the invention of the airlock itself, or sas à air in French, that you needed to make this system work. But it had actually been fully described and patented in England 10 years before by a remarkable chap, the polymath Lord Thomas Cochrane, 10th Earl of Dundonald. Cochrane was a Scottish peer, naval officer and a politician, had an absolutely fascinating career and would be well worth another talk on another occasion. In 1818, he jointly patented the tunnelling shield with Mark Isambard Brunel for the Thames Tunnel. And he then went on to be the first to suggest a practical system of tunnelling using compressed air. But most importantly for our story, which is about bridges, he also patented the first proper airlock in 1830, although he didn't use that term. So this is before Triget's work. And his airlock was an upright closed cylinder of iron with airtight doors. The first door opened inwards from the open air, and the second opened inwards into an anteroom. The working space below was filled with compressed air by means of pumps, so a man could enter the lock through the outer door and close it behind him. He'd then open a valve to allow the compressed air up from the working chamber to raise the air pressure in the whole lock, and then he could pass through the inner door, open the circular hatch and climb down into the working chamber. And to leave the chamber, that process would be reversed. Now, the first attempt to actually build a new foundation below the bed of a river, or in this case the sea, using compressed air came in 1841, when an interesting and very eccentric English civil engineer called William Bush had patented a method of sinking a caisson using compressed air for the construction of a lighthouse. He tried out his ideas when he was building a beacon on Goodwin Sands, which is a group of very treacherous sandbanks off the southeast coast of England that is really notorious for shipwrecks. All previous attempts to place any kind of lighthouse on the sands had failed, and Bush spent several years attempting to construct his lighthouse using this primitive form of compressed air caisson. The project was dogged by bad weather, shipping disasters, incompetent workers, and lots of other problems, but he did eventually succeed in 1844, completing his caisson and the main structure of the beacon with a small living area above. However, even after all this, almost immediately the authorities ordered him to take down and remove the quite ridiculous structure. Bush, despite being repeatedly warned against it, had built his lighthouse in the middle of the sands instead of at the edge. So it would have had the effect of leading vessels into danger instead of warning them off. So Bush's experiment was a failure, but mainly because he built the lighthouse in the wrong place. He did, however, manage to build a firm foundation using a pneumatic caisson method, and that structure's still there, buried under the sand. But probably because the project was a disaster as a whole, his work didn't really attract much attention. In the same year, 1844, Dr. Lawrence Holker Potts, a medical doctor with an interest in physical science and incidentally a great-grandson of a former warden of the Rochester Bridge Trust, launched his idea for using pneumatic power to make foundations in soft ground. And this was patented by him under the name Dr. Potts' pneumatic process, which sounds like something out of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Potts had almost certainly got his idea following a visit to a construction site in 1842 at Gravesend, not far from Rochester, where John Baldry Redman constructed this structure, the Royal Terrace Pier, using the first example of open cast iron caissons. So Redman, who was working with the contractor Fox and Henderson, he placed an iron cylinder open at the top and the bottom and forced it with weights into the bed of the River Thames. The material inside was then excavated by hand until bedrock was reached and the pier could be built inside the dry space. Potts's idea and the Potts pneumatic process was to substitute pneumatic power for manual labour in the first process of driving the cylinders. So if you look at the left-hand side of this diagram, a narrow hollow tube open at the lower end was placed in the required location. So that's the left-hand one of those two tubes you can see there. The air was pumped out until a vacuum or a semi-vacuum was formed, and that made the cylinder descend into the riverbed, its lower rim cutting its way through the sand and gravel. And the space in the tube previously occupied by air would then be filled by the gradual ascent of the displaced materials, and that would go on until the tube was completely full. And once the tube was driven down deep enough, it would then be emptied of its sand by means of a pump and a tube, which you can see in the right-hand diagram. And the tube was known as an elephant. And once they'd removed all the material, it would be filled with concrete and masonry. And again, here is another example of them exaggerating the width of that tube. The first example of Potts' process being used successfully at scale was again with the contractor Fox and Henderson, this time for a railway viaduct in North Wales, but also for another couple of bridges at Windsor and at Huntingdon. For all of those projects, the cylinders were only about 12 inches in diameter, and the riverbeds concerned were homogeneous and sandy. So for the first example of the true use of pneumatic caissons for the building of a bridge foundation, we need to turn to Rochester. So I just want to briefly dwell on some geography and history so we know where we are. So Rochester lies in the southeast corner of England, closest to the continent of mainland Europe. And when the Romans invaded in England in AD 43, they landed on the east coast and marched westwards towards the site which would become London. They land on the east coast and they move up towards London, which is underneath the red badge of Invicta that you can see on the left-hand side. And the first major obstacle they needed to cross was the River Medway, which you can see there right in the middle. And because that was their first obstacle, so the Roman army built its first major bridge in England at Rochester with a span of about 500 feet. A fort was built to protect the bridge, which developed into an important trading centre and eventually developed into the city of Rochester. And the Roman Rochester Bridge survived the fall of the Roman Empire. It was the only large bridge in England to do so, and it survived much maintained until 1391, when the river froze solid and swept away the old Roman bridge. It was then replaced with a stone arch bridge that was built about 100 yards upstream away from the ruins of the Roman structure. A charity, the Rochester Bridge Trust, that I now work for, was created to maintain that crossing in perpetuity. And this medieval bridge served its purpose for over 400 years, until the Industrial Revolution brought a substantial increase in the amount of river traffic and the amount and weight of road traffic. And if you look in this very busy scene right over on the right-hand side, you can just see the bridge showing in the corner there. So by the 1840s, it was clear that a new modern bridge was needed with a wider carriageway and more headroom. Sir William Cubitt was appointed as the bridge engineer, working alongside his son Joseph. And they had to contend with the challenging salty waters of the River Medway, where the tidal range is up to 21 feet. The new bridge would be constructed back on the line of the Roman road, so the medieval bridge could continue in use until Cubitt had finished its replacement. It would have 3 stone piers with cast iron arches of 140, 170 and 140 feet spans, and a swing bridge with a 50-foot span. And Cubitt's intention was to found each of those piers on 14 cast iron hollow piles up to 7 feet in diameter, sunk down through layers of saturated soft clay, sand and gravel to the solid chalk below. And the challenge was to find a practical and efficient way to drive those cast iron piles, which would need to be nearly 61 feet below the high water level. Cubitt was determined to avoid traditional cofferdams that the Romans had used because they would be slow and expensive, and he also rejected the method of construction of the medieval bridge foundations because the piers had been built on timber and rubble platforms founded on hundreds of shallow iron-tipped piles driven by manual pile drivers, and that bridge's foundations had been so precarious throughout its 450-year history and in need of continual maintenance and repair. So Cubitt needed a solution for foundations for the new, higher and much more substantial bridge that would be more reliable and not require such intensive management. So he decided he was going to use some sort of cast iron caisson method. So the Cubitts had used John Redmond's open caissons at their Nene Bridge in Peterborough. Sorry, the slides are going forwards on their own, so I'm going to have to keep going backwards. So they'd used the open caisson method at Nene Bridge, but those wouldn't have been sufficiently stable in the tidal conditions in the middle of the River Medway. And Cubitt had shown a lot of interest in Pott's process, and he and his son had tried unsuccessfully to use it on a couple of occasions. But despite that earlier failure, he decided to try it again at Rochester. However, very early on, there were problems because the first cylinder they tried to drive struck the forgotten remains of the Roman bridge in the riverbed, meaning it was impossible to create the vacuum needed so they could use the atmospheric pressure to drive the piles. Although frustrating for Cubitt, the discovery and recording of the Roman remains was a piece of fantastic luck for posterity because it gives us a full and accurate archaeological account of how that first stone bridge on the site had been constructed back in AD 43. But the failure of the Potts process was a major problem for Cubitt, as he now had no efficient method of constructing the deep piers for his bridge. So working together, Cubitt, his resident engineer John Wright, and one of Fox and Henderson's engineers called John Hughes, quickly devised a solution by reversing the Potts process. Instead of pumping the air out of the caisson to create a vacuum, they decided to pump compressed air into it using a 6-horsepower steam engine to make each tubular pile behave like a diving bell. So each pier, timber staging was built to give a large working platform for the men and machinery. They floated each 7-foot diameter iron cylinder into place and sunk it as far as possible under its own weight. The cylinders were 9-foot lengths of tube bolted together so the top was just above high water level. The sides were reinforced, but the top and the bottom of the tube were initially open. Then they fixed a wrought iron plate across the top of the tube with openings for 2 cast iron D-shaped chambers, and that's the E and F on the left hand of this picture. Each of these chambers was 6 foot high and formed an airlock, the first time this word was used. Each of the chambers had an airtight trapdoor 2 foot across in the top and an airtight door 3 foot by 4 foot in the flat side. Compressed air was then pumped into the caisson tube to drive the water out and keep it out, and the pressure went up as far as 1.8 atmospheres at the maximum at the deepest stage of these works. The labourers went down through the airlock, and with the compressed air keeping the water out, they were able to dig the material up from the riverbed and send it up to the surface in buckets. And there's quite a clever system here because the two D-shaped airlocks were on the same diameter but facing in opposite directions. So as they raised a bucket up to the level of the airlock, it would swing on a jib into the airlock itself through the open door. And by that means, they were able to use the airlock to remove the material without losing the compressed air within the working chamber. So they would do this until they'd excavated about 14 inches below the bottom of the cylinder. Then all the men would climb out, the pressure would be reduced, and the cylinder would then sink under its own weight. And they'd carry on doing this until the top of the cylinder was approaching the high water level. At that point, the work would have to be stopped and the airlocks would be removed. Another 9-foot length of tube was bolted to the top, and the airlocks reinstalled on the top of the new section of the cylinder, and the work would begin again. And this cycle was repeated until each one of these caisson tubes reached the chalk. The iron cylinder was then anchored to the bedrock and the worker's space filled up with concrete. Once all the piles were in the river, with 14 of them for each pier, the rest of the construction could be completed very quickly. The new bridge was opened with a firework display in 1856, and the piers that were constructed still support Rochester Bridge today. Ominously, there were some concerns about the health of the men who worked in the caissons at Rochester, including complaints of ear pain and laboured breathing. Luckily, there were no serious and lasting injuries, but this story would soon change as engineers pushed this new technology to more and more ambitious depths. The mining engineer Triget had been aware of some potential health risks too. His first mining caisson was only used for 2 weeks, but the miners were working in them for 7 to 10-hour shifts. He described breathlessness and joint pains that appeared in the workers approximately half an hour after returning to the surface. Concerned about the dangers of working in the caissons, Triget hired 2 doctors, Dr. Poll and Dr. Wattel, to oversee the medical needs of 64 labourers on his next project at Douchy in northern France. And we need to bear in mind he was using pneumatic caissons up to 3.5 times normal atmospheric pressure. And the doctors did a proper study of the symptoms and reported shortness of breath, joint pains, itchy skin, chest pains, temporary paralysis upon leaving the caisson. And this is the first proper recorded incidence of decompression sickness in humans. The doctors correctly linked the symptoms to the rate of decompression. However, they mistakenly thought that caused decreased oxygen in the circulation, leading to congestion of the blood vessels and the spinal membranes. For the moment, the health concerns at Douchy and Rochester were not serious enough for the bridge engineers to reject this exciting and efficient new pneumatic caisson technique. John Hughes presented a paper to the Institution of Civil Engineers, which became the basis of the use of the new method, and soon bridge engineers from all over the world were asking the Rochester team questions and seeking their advice. In the late 1850s and 60s, pneumatic caissons were used for bridges in Germany, France, Ireland, Hungary, Denmark and Russia, and each time slight modifications and progressive improvements were made to the airlocks and the pumping arrangements. The caissons were considered for 2 bridges in the US over the PD and Santee rivers in the Carolinas in 1855 and 57, although I've not been able to confirm whether those were actually built, so it'd be interesting if anyone can answer that question this evening. Around 1858, Robert Stevenson employed the technique for his tubular bridge over the Nile for the Egyptian railway, and he used caisson which was 28 by 19 feet, which would hold 40 men. So very, very quickly, they're really expanding how ambitious they're going to be with this. One of the very earliest adopters was Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And he employed John Hughes from Rochester to advise on his very ambitious Royal Albert Bridge over the Tamar at Saltash in Cornwall. Originally, the bridge was to have 7 openings with multiple piers in the river. However, after pressure from the river users and a very thorough, typical Brunel survey of the geology, he decided he could use a pneumatic caisson and it would allow him to build just one single huge pier in the centre. It was built using a wrought iron cylinder of 35 feet in diameter, sunk in bedrock to 70 foot of water and 16 feet of mud. It was 6 feet longer on one side than the other to accommodate the slope of the rocky riverbed. And Brunel's assistant engineer, Robert Pearson Brereton, came up with an innovation called an annular ring inside the cylinder, which you can see particularly on the right-hand side of this diagram. And by having this ring with a domed roof across the top, it meant they only needed to pump the compressed air into that ring and didn't need to seal the whole of the lower chamber. So two 10 horsepower steam engines were used to drive the pumps, and they could get 30 or 40 men working in this ring at any time, excavating the material from the riverbed. And once it was down to its full depth, they actually built a circular wall of granite ashlar, 4 feet thick, which acted then as a watertight cofferdam, so the men could finish the work in the open air without having to work in compressed air. The finished pier, which you can see there in the centre, the bottom of it, you can just see the bottom of the pier. It was a circular column of masonry 96 feet high from its foundation on the bedrock to the upper surface just above high water level, and then it had 4 cast iron columns 100 feet high on the top, which supported the truss above. Now, at this site, there were initially many cases of decompression sickness, and they gradually reduced the length of the shift down to 3 hours. And some later sources state that this was the first site where there was a death from decompression sickness, but I haven't been able to find anything contemporary which confirms that. Now, in the US, early examples included the construction of a bridge for the Charleston and Savannah Railroad in 1859 by General William Suey Smith. He sunk several cylinders for the foundations and made important improvements, including a method of blowing sand out through pipes, and it would shoot high up into the air using the compressed air to take it away from the foundations. In 1860, pneumatic caissons were proposed by W.J. McAlpine for use for the Washington Bridge over the Harlem River in New York, although that bridge wasn't constructed for another 20 years. In 1868, General Smith worked with the marvellously named Theophilus Ellsworth Sickles to use the method again to sink the piers of their Omaha Bridge. On each site, the debilitating symptoms of decompression sickness were noted to a greater or lesser extent. And although doctors Poll and Mortel in France before 1850 had come close to isolating the cause, their theory was not widely accepted, and a few advancements were made in understanding how to treat it effectively. So on these sites, all sorts of quack remedies were tried: cold water baths, natural oils, cordials, quinine, leeches, zinc and silver amulets, and even submersion in liquid mercury, which really can't have made anyone feel any better. Turning now to the 2 most important and famous US examples. First of all, St. Louis, Missouri. So by 1868, the Mississippi River shipping trade had declined because of the advent of the railroad, and Chicago was growing into the centre of commerce in the West. So a new bridge was conceived as a solution for the city of St. Louis to help it regain eminence by connecting rail and river transport across the river. Lots of political manoeuvres and opposition from the steamboat interests meant that it required spans and heights previously unheard of, meaning it was impossible to erect a bridge according to traditional techniques. With a background in river salvage and diving, but no real prior experience in bridge design, James Buchanan Eads was appointed as its chief engineer, and he proposed a triple-span bridge which was going to need 2 substantial mid-river piers. Eads visited Europe in early 1869 to consult bridge engineers and view the pneumatic caisson techniques in use, and inspired by what he saw, he set out to use that method to build 2 of the largest caissons that had been attempted so far, and which are still amongst the largest ever built for a bridge. The bedrock on his site was 125 feet below the water level on the Illinois side and 85 feet below on the Missouri side. So that meant the deepest of his caissons would need to be over 110 feet below the riverbed. The East Caisson was launched and sunk in October 1869. 2 engines pumped compressed air into the working chamber, which was accessed by a candle-lit spiral staircase and entered via airlocks. As the workers dug through the sandy riverbed and the caisson sank deeper, air pressure from the pumps had to be increased to compensate for the higher water pressure outside. And above their heads, the stonework for the piers was being built at the same time in an open cofferdam. When the East Caisson hit bedrock in February 1870, the pressure inside the chamber measured nearly 54 pounds per square inch, which is over 3.5 times normal air pressure at sea level. Now, although by this time in Europe, the risks to health of working in compressed air were well known and they were managing access very carefully, Eads and his team seemed initially completely unconcerned. These pressurized chambers compartments were a source of great curiosity. Eads himself used to lead tour parties of friends, politicians and members of the public down the spiral staircase and into the air chambers as a sort of tourist attraction. And while there, the visitors would report an eerie atmosphere, water dripping from above, the hissing of escaping air, and they described a nearly intolerable odour. And while some people found the experience wholly terrifying, other people found it amusing and exciting. The high air pressure would cause the voices to sound nasal and high-pitched. It was impossible to whistle, and candles blown out appeared to magically reignite themselves. However, as the weeks went on and the caissons passed a depth of 60 feet, which had been the maximum at Rochester, the severe physical effects of working in the pressurised air became apparent. Workers began to complain of cold sweats and severe stomach, head and joint pains. Others suffered temporary paralysis in legs and arms, causing several to be admitted to a local hospital. One day, a worker named James Riley emerged from an access shaft, informed a friend that he was feeling unwell, and promptly collapsed and died. A few hours later, another died at the city hospital, followed by 3 more in quick succession. The excruciating joint pains and abdominal pain caused the men to bend forward from the waist as they emerged into normal air pressure. And there was a ladies' fashion of the 1860s and 70s, nicknamed the Grecian bend, because the tight corsets and large bustles made women appear to be leaning forward from the waist. And so the similarity between the postures meant that decompression sickness now became known as the bends. Now very alarmed, Eads appointed his family physician, Dr. Alphonse Jaminet, to investigate the problem. And Jaminet knew about the symptoms because he'd suffered himself after a 2-hour guided tour of the East Caisson. He understood that the problem was related to the rate of change of pressure and the time spent in the caissons, so he reduced the shift times and the times between shifts. But Jaminet found the unruly behaviour of the men really frustrating because they just wouldn't listen to his warnings and obey his instructions to lie down and rest for a spell after leaving the caissons. And so to try and enforce the rules, a floating hospital was built next to the East Pier, where the men were forced to drink 3/4 of a pint of strong beef tea and rest before they were allowed to go home. Jaminet also insisted the men should spend longer in the airlock and allow the decompression to happen more slowly. And although he didn't really understand the physiology, he'd hit on the effective way to control the bends. Nevertheless, by the end of the foundation works, nearly 25% of all the workers had suffered from decompression sickness. No doubt there were actually more who left the project when they found out the work made them ill. But there was no shortage of labour willing to take the risks for the very good pay on offer. The bridge was a great success, but the price paid was high. Between 13 and 15 workers died, and in all the sources I've looked at, no one seems to settle on a fixed number. 2 other workers were permanently disabled, and at least 77 were severely afflicted. In May 1870, overlapping with the Eads project, Washington Roebling began construction on the 1,600-foot span Brooklyn Bridge. At 16,000 square feet, the footprint of his caissons was 3 times larger than those used by Eads. The largest one was for the New York Tower, and it had a rectangular base 170 feet long and 102 feet wide, with an air chamber 9.5 feet high. The roof was 22 feet thick. As at the Eads Bridge, the caisson was used in a double capacity, having a cofferdam above as well as an air chamber below. The air chamber was made of timber and lined with thin boiler iron to make it fireproof, the whole held together by angle irons and bolts. It weighed over 13,000 tons, in which were laid 30,000 tons of masonry. And this caisson, as you can see from this illustration, it became like a small underground city. As well as a spiral staircase, as the work went deeper, the caisson was provided with a steam-operated elevator because they found that climbing the stairs at the end of the shift would exacerbate the bends. Coils of steam pipe were introduced to maintain a comfortable temperature. Gas lighting was provided. And to supply the immense amount of compressed air needed, 13 large compressors were provided with the air conveyed by rubber hoses. At Brooklyn, a physician, Dr. Andrew H. Smith, was appointed from the start to oversee the health of the Caisson workforce. In 1873, he gave a speech to the College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York based on the 110 serious cases he'd observed, and he formally called the condition Caisson disease for the first time in English and published that name in a textbook later that year. As well as the usual symptoms of the bends, he noticed there were faster heart rates caused by increased levels of carbon dioxide from the incomplete combustion of the gas lamps in the caisson, and lots of dehydration caused by the hot, humid working conditions. His preferred treatments were morphine and the anti-poisoning drug atropine, both of which were ineffective in curing the root physiological cause of the problem, which he simply didn't understand. In 1871, after personally inspecting the working conditions in one of the caissons, Washington Roebling himself had suffered an extreme case of decompression sickness from which he never recovered and was left paralysed for the rest of his life. For every 2 feet the caisson descended, the air pressure increased by 1 psi, and when iron probes underneath the Manhattan caisson found the bedrock to be even deeper than Roebling expected, he halted the work in fear of increased risk of decompression sickness and decided to found the bridge on the hard-packed sand instead. The tragedy of the Brooklyn Bridge is that Andrew Smith included in his report to the New York Bridge Company in 1873 a recommendation that future projects should include provision of a decompression chamber. He suggested that a tube 9 foot long, 3.5 feet in diameter, should be set up at the surface with one end closed and the other having an airtight door opening inwards. A patient would be sent inside on a sliding bed, and the air pressure in the tube would be raised to the same level as the caisson. That pressure would be released very gradually as the patient indicated the pain was diminishing. His concept was exactly the same as the hospital or medical lock, only eventually introduced in 1890, and very similar to that used today. Had the Bridge Company installed such a device at Brooklyn and used it as he described there would have been no suffering from the bends by anyone, including Washington Roebling. And the reputation of the Brooklyn Bridge project, completed in May 1883, would have been quite different had Smith's suggestion been taken up. The pneumatic caissons had opened up opportunities for ever more ambitious civil engineering projects, although much more care was taken for health after the Eads and Brooklyn Bridge projects. Pneumatic caissons were used in 1874 for the construction of the ill-fated Tay Bridge and 1890 for the Forth Bridge in Scotland. It was used for 2 of the 4 piers of the Eiffel Tower, the construction of coastal lighthouses, and a number of the bigger New York skyscrapers. It was not a cheap method. Wages for the caisson workers was necessarily high, reflecting the risks and the severe work environment. And although it was less labour-intensive than medieval and Roman methods, the dependence on manual labour for most of the excavation still made it a slow and inefficient technique in an increasingly mechanised world. It was a French physiologist, Paul Bert, who worked out the actual mechanism of decompression sickness in 1871. His particular interest was in high-altitude ballooning, but he built chambers to experiment with barometric pressure and conducted experiments on rapid decompression in mice and dogs and birds. And through those experiments, Bert identified that nitrogen gas bubbles formed in the veins and tissues of animals as they spent time in compressed air. He showed that by slowing down the rate of decompression, gaseous nitrogen could be expelled harmlessly through the lungs, especially if the subject was given supplementary oxygen. And it was those bubbles of nitrogen that caused all the symptoms of caisson disease. The bubbles settled in the solid tissues and the major joints and caused the excruciating pain and bent posture. They could also form in the bloodstream, causing an arterial embolism or a range of other breathing problems which became known as the chokes. There were also the staggers for neurological problems, including headache, visual disturbance, loss of balance, vertigo, tingling, confusion, all of them caused by the nitrogen bubbles. It was Sir Ernest Moyer who actually made the first decompression chamber on the Hudson Tunnel project in 1890 to a plan almost identical to that proposed by Andrew Smith. It was said that in the building of those tunnels, there were at least 3 men who, to all intents and purposes, were dead, but after being treated in the medical airlock, have fully recovered. By the end of the 19th century, there had been more than 1,000 recorded serious disabilities and deaths arising from Caisson disease. It was only when the marvellously moustached British physiologist named John Scott Haldane published so-called decompression tables in 1907 that truly effective measures against the condition were introduced. These tables used observational data from an artificial compression chamber, which he tested on goats, and an algorithm developed by Haldane, and he used those to set out the stages and durations of rest needed to decompress safely after a period in a high-pressure environment. And a version of Haldane's tables is still used by divers today when decompressing. And despite all the risks, pneumatic caissons continue to be very actively used for a wide range of projects in most of Europe and North America until around the 1930s, when the development of better long and massive steel piles and improved construction machinery allowed this pneumatic method to be confined to only the very biggest projects and for use in tunnelling. The main exceptions were in Germany until the 1950s, and particularly in Japan, where the technology was introduced from the US after an earthquake in 1923, and extensive use was made of them in Japan for all the infrastructure for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, and they're still very much in favour for large bridge construction. In the time I haven't had time to really explore any early Canadian examples in this presentation, but one much later but interesting structure is the Honoré-Mercier Bridge in Montreal, constructed from 1934 to 42. Interesting because it's using pneumatic caissons quite late on, and also because it was apparently the first bridge in Quebec built only by French Canadians, which I found interesting. And there we are. I hope you've enjoyed this very fast gallop through the history of the bends and pneumatic caissons and found it interesting. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll do my best to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sue, for a really interesting presentation. If you'd like to put your questions into the question and answer section on the bottom of your screen, then we will try to answer those. So you should find a Q&A button. If you can do that and type in your question, that would be great. Meanwhile, perhaps, Sue, you could let us know how the piers that were built in the 1850s that you've described, how do they perform today?
Well, the piers at Rochester are absolutely sound. We've recently done a refurbishment and we didn't have to do anything to them at all. So, in fact, they're the part of the bridge that seems to be holding up better than anywhere else. The Cubits actually built a railway bridge alongside a couple of years later using the same technique, and those foundations are still, again, absolutely sound. It does seem to have been a very successful approach.
And a question from Mike Bartlett. How far did the Rochester Bridge caissons go?
61 feet below high water. So that's at least, where are we? Sort of, no, sorry. I think is it 61 feet below the riverbed, actually? Yeah, 61 feet. And that was the point at which on the Eads Bridge, when they got down that far, that was when they started to really notice the problems with the Caisson disease. So I think Rochester was lucky that it stopped just before it really started to affect people.
Yeah, we've got a couple of thank yous for a really good presentation in the Q&A, but no questions yet. So perhaps I could be cheeky and say I noticed in the presentation that William Bush, I think it was, tried to build a lighthouse. Did anybody ever build a lighthouse using that technique?
Yeah, they certainly did. It's certainly towards in the sort of 1870s onwards, it did become quite a common approach in North America, actually more so than around the UK. So, yeah, it did catch on. I'm not sure I'd fancy it in rough sea. The open top of the caisson is quite worrying.
Okay, and then the question from the Q&A: were there any consequences to the engineers because of the people dying, the workers dying?
Didn't work like that really, did it, in the Victorian era? Yeah, I mean, certainly at Rochester, no one did die. I don't know whether it's true that the first person died on Brunel's site at Saltash, but I'm not aware. Maybe someone who knows a bit more about the Eads Bridge would know if there was any consequences there. That was obviously the first one where the biggest initial number of deaths was.
Okay. Any other questions from any of the participants, any of the audience?
I've obviously told you everything you could ever want to know about Caissons.
Yeah. A question from Jeff Peaty. Were segments of the caissons simply bolted together, or did they use any material to form a better seal?
They appear to have just been bolted together. So in all the diagrams that I've looked at, there's nothing to suggest there was any kind of gasket. On some of them, the bolted sections were all inside the tube, which makes perfect sense. Obviously, you're trying to drive down, but they just seem to have been bolted together. Can't find any example of anything else being used. It's certainly not labelled on the diagrams.
You mentioned that in the building, I think it was of the Brooklyn Bridge, that people who visited could hear the air leaking out.
Well, it was the hissing sound in the Eads, and I don't know whether that's leaking out or it's just the sound of the pumps driving the compressed air into the system. So it's coming down through rubber hoses, and I think there were 13 engines running at Brooklyn. So I think it's as much as that process as anything leaking out of anywhere. The terrifying thing is the thought that you'd be in that gap at the bottom, 9.5 feet high, and above your head are thousands of tons of masonry being constructed above your head. I think I'd be more concerned about that than the compressed air, personally.
Yeah, scary. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to thank you very much, Sue, for a really fascinating presentation. And let's just finish the webinar with information about the next webinar, which will be in January, and it will be on the Eads Bridge that Sue mentioned and described. So if you're interested in that, it's going to have its 150th year anniversary next year. So on in February of next year, we will be having a talk and preempt the anniversary slightly for that bridge. The PDH, if you're interested, certificate, the second code word is Roebling, again, that Sue mentioned, great American bridge builder. So you'll use that in the survey that will appear after the webinar ends. So you're going to need the first one, Gzowski, and the second one, Roebling, to do that. So certainly, if you want a PDH certificate, please do that. But I would thank you for attending, and we'll see you again in February of next year. Have a Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in February. Goodbye.
The new transatlantic cable webinars are coordinated by a tripartite ad hoc committee that includes the individuals listed here.